Afterword. The Miss Dashwoods and their mother were sitting down to their dinner on a warm April afternoon when their servant came in with the news. "I have just met Mrs. Ferrers as she was passing in her carriage. She sends her regards." As he saw the ladies' changed faces, he added, "It was Miss Lucy Steele before, madam. She is married to Mr. Ferrers now." "Yes," said Mrs. Dashwood, observing how white the faces of her two elder daughters were. "Thank you, Thomas." Eleanor now learned the difference between expecting a painful event and experiencing it. For the first time in her life, she felt she would not be able to stay calm a minute longer. And then she was forced to do so, because Edward Ferras's figure appeared outside the house. He came in, was welcomed, and asked a few questions about the weather and the roads. There was a long silence, interrupted heroically by Eleanor, who asked, "And how is Mrs. Ferrers? Is she waiting for you in the carriage?" "My mother?" said Edward with some surprise. "I believe she is in London." "I meant Mrs. Edward Ferrers." "Perhaps you meant Mrs. Robert Ferrers," Edward said slowly. "Mrs. Robert Ferrers?" repeated the ladies. It turned out that after it became clear that Mrs. Ferrers would not change her mind, and indeed pass all Edward's money on to Robert, Lucy suddenly moved her affection to him, too. 2 weeks after the Miss Dashwoods had left London, she wrote a letter to Edward explaining that she was going to marry his younger brother, with whom she was greatly in love. Edward's engagement to Lucy was formed when Edward was very young and could not yet judge people better. But later, when he realized his mistake, it was too late, as Lucy seemed to be so much in love with him that he felt he could not break his word to her. He had never realized that she had been after his money all the time. At any rate, Edward was now free and came to Barton to ask for Eleanor's hand, which was what he had long wanted to do. It can be easily guessed what her reply was. Eleanor and Edward lived very happily in their small house next to Colonel Brandon's residence. It was not far from Barton College either. Their happiness increased even more when, after 2 years, Marianne moved to live with the Colonel as his wife. Neither Eleanor nor her mother had ever dared to suggest this marriage to her. Marianne simply started to gradually find Colonel Brandon a very good companion. His tastes in books and music turned out to be exceptionally good. She valued all his other opinions more and more. In time, she even forgave his flannel waistcoat. And as Marianne could never do anything by halves, she finally married the man whom she loved with all her heart.
Stories for Reading Comprehension by L.A. Hill. Cassette 2. Published and copyright Longman Group Limited, 1985.
Unit 1. There is not enough petrol in the world for everybody now, and each year there is less. So what are we going to do when it finishes? Perhaps we will go back to horses and carriages and bicycles. In the Second World War, some people did not use petrol in their cars. They made gas from wood and plants instead, and then they put it in big bags on top of their cars. The cars did not go fast, but it was better than nothing. But we cannot cut down all our trees to make gas. We need them for other things too. Besides gas, we can also use electricity for our cars. But first, we must make the electricity. Some countries have coal, and they make electricity with that. But we will not always have coal. Other countries have big, strong rivers, and these turn turbines and make electricity more easily and cheaply. We are also able to get power from the tides. We put turbines in the mouth of a river. Then, when the tide comes up, it turns the turbines, and when it runs back towards the sea, it turns them again. And we know that the waves of the sea can also turn turbines when they go up and down. Which of all these things will make our electricity in the year 2000?
Unit 2. Sally was 19 years old. She had always lived with her parents, but now the time had come for her to go to university in another part of the country to study to be a doctor. Her mother was very sad about this, and she was also afraid, because she loved her daughter very much, and she thought, "My little girl will be alone for the first time in her life. She won't know anybody. There will be nobody to look after her, and perhaps she will have trouble, or she will be very sad because she isn't with us." Sally said goodbye to her father and to her cat and promised to telephone every week. Then her mother took her to the university by train. When they said goodbye, her mother cried. And on the way back home, she cried again. Then every week, Sally kept her promise and telephoned. They talked for several minutes, and Sally was always very happy and never said that she missed her parents. Her mother was not glad about this. She thought, "Perhaps she's finding the university nicer than her home." But then some holidays were getting near. That week, when Sally telephoned her parents, she said, "The students who live here were talking yesterday evening, and they said, 'We are very happy that we're going to return home again soon for a few days.'" Sally's mother was very glad that the students had said this. She must really miss us, she thought. Then she said, "And did you say that too?" "Oh, yes," Sally answered. "We all said that it's easy to speak to our parents on the telephone every week when we're away, but we really miss our pets."
Unit 3. Derek was a little boy. He lived with his parents in a small house in a town. They did not have a big garden. Derek liked animals very much. One day he said to his father, "I've got a little money, Daddy. Can I buy a pony, please?" But his father answered, "No, Derek. We can't have a pony in the garden because it's too small, and we haven't got a field. People who keep ponies in small gardens without a field are unkind. Ponies need a lot of space." Derek did not want to be unkind to a pony, so he did not ask his father again. But then his father got a job in another place, and he and his family left their small house in the town and went and lived in a bigger house in the country. It had a nice garden and a field, and Derek was very happy. There was a farm near their new house, and there were horses, cows, and a few sheep there. Derek went to see them every day. He was 5 years old now, and he began to think of a pony again. My birthday is next month, he thought. Perhaps Daddy will buy me a pony then. After a little time, he began to talk about ponies to his parents again. Then his birthday came. His parents gave him a few nice presents, but there was no pony. Derek was sad. But then, suddenly, his Uncle Tom arrived. He was a farmer, and he had a big pony with him. "Hello, Derek," Uncle Tom said. "Happy birthday. This is your birthday present from me and Aunt Mary." Derek was a little afraid, because the pony was very big. He looked at it for a few minutes, and then he said to his uncle, "Is he for me, or am I for him?"
Unit 4. When Mr. Holland was a young man, he played a lot of football, and he had always been thin and very strong. But then he worked in an office for many years, and he drove to work in a car. So when he was 40, he was fat and very soft, and he did not wish to get fatter and softer every year. One day one of his friends said to him, "Would you like to be thinner, Fred?" "Of course I would," Mr. Holland answered. "Well," his friend said, "stop going to your office by car and get a bicycle." Mr. Holland had not ridden a bicycle for many years. "It's very hard to learn to ride a bicycle again at your age," his wife said. But it was not too hard for Mr. Holland to do. He usually sat in his living room and read the newspaper in the evening, but he bought a bicycle for his birthday and practiced riding that every evening instead. He hoped that it would help him to get thinner, and he got a lot of pleasure from it. He found little roads which were not really very narrow, but were too narrow for cars, and there he got away from the nasty noises of the city, which were becoming too much for him. They were not really very loud, but they were too loud for Mr. Holland. Then he began to go to his office on his bicycle. Sometimes all the cars stopped at a red light, and he went past them to the front, because his bicycle was narrow. Then he was very happy. Yesterday he stopped at a red light, and a man came up behind him on another bicycle. He stopped too, and said to Mr. Holland, "Have the police taken your driving license away too?"
Unit 5. Mary Williams was a clever young lady. She lived alone and had a very important business job in a big company. She worked very hard in it. She was never absent. She always arrived at her office early and left late. And she often took reports home with her to read. At weekends, she seldom went anywhere, and she was always working then, too. Jill Thomas was a friend of Mary's. In fact, she was Mary's best friend. They had gone to the same school, and both of them were clever women. But Jill was married, and she did not want to get a job. "I'm quite happy at home with Len," she always said. "I don't want to be too busy to have fun." Jill and Len liked walking very much, and nearly every weekend they went to the mountains and walked there. They also liked dancing very much, and they often went out in the evening and danced till the early hours of the next morning. And when they had their holidays, they climbed all the mountains one by one, and swam and sailed on a lake and danced nearly all the time. One year Jill said to Mary, "Would you like to have a holiday with us this year, Mary?" Mary was very happy, so Jill and Mary and Len had 2 weeks together. Mary enjoyed her holiday, but she was very tired after they had climbed all the mountains and swum every day and danced every night. The next summer, Jill offered to take Mary on their holiday again. "Thank you very much," answered Mary, "but I'm going to be quite honest with you. I'm sorry that I can't come, because I've worked a lot this year and I'm tired. But I don't need a holiday. I need a rest."
Unit 6. Mr. Robinson died, and after that only Mrs. Robinson lived in their small house. She was very old. Her son John lived with his wife and child in another street, and he often said to his mother, "You must come and live with us." But she always answered, "No, I'm very happy in my little house, and I don't want to leave it." At 8 o'clock one morning, the old woman telephoned her son and said, "Please come to my house." Then she put the phone down. John's wife said, "Who was that?" "It was Mother," he answered. "What did she want?" "She wants me. Perhaps she's ill. I'll take the car and go to work from her house." He took his car out and drove to his mother's house quickly. When the old woman opened the door, her son said, "What's the matter, Mother?" "Come in," she answered. "There's a thief in one of my cupboards." "A thief in one of your cupboards?" said John. "When did you find him?" "I heard noises in a cupboard yesterday evening," she answered. "Which one?" John asked quietly. They were in the dining room now. "That one," the old woman answered. "Why didn't you telephone me then?" John asked. "Because it was late, and I didn't want to trouble you," she answered. "But the thief hasn't stayed in the cupboard all night, has he?" asked John. "Oh, yes, he has," the old woman answered. "I nailed the door up, and then I went to bed."
Unit 7. While Bill was still at school, he used to earn some money by delivering newspapers. But when he left school, he was ready to get himself a proper job. "I'll work in a bank," he said to himself, "because my uncle has always worked in one." He went to his aunt and said, "I think that the work is easy. Uncle Bob can do it, so I can." His aunt smiled, but did not say anything. When Bill's uncle came home that evening, his wife told him that Bill wanted to work in a bank, and his uncle said, "That's a good idea, but there are no jobs in my bank just now." So Bill went to several other banks and asked for a job, and in the end he got one. You may work here for a month, the manager said, and if you're good enough, you can stay after that. You'll work with Mr. Unwin for the first month. He'll take you round and train you and report to me about you. Mr. Unwin was one of the other clerks in the bank, and he had been there for many years. He took Bill round the bank, and Bill learned a lot of things from him. Some of these lessons were not easy. Then, one day, Mr. Unwin gave Bill some £1 notes. "Count these," he ordered him. "There ought to be 100 there. If there aren't, tell me, and try not to make any mistakes." Bill sat down by Mr. Unwin and began to count the notes. But he was lazy, and when he had counted half of them, he became tired. 51, 52, 53, he said, and then he stopped, looked at Mr. Unwin, and pointed at the notes. "Well," he said, "if they're correct up to here, they'll all be correct, won't they?"
Unit 8. Joe Biggs was a butcher. His shop was in a village in one of the most beautiful parts of the south of England, and he worked in it for many years while his father was there. Then, when his father reached the age of 65, he stopped working in the shop, and Joe was alone in it, so he had to work harder. Joe worked 5.5 days a week. His shop shut at 1 o'clock on Thursdays, and it was shut the whole of Sunday. Saturdays were the busiest days. Most of Joe's meat came to his shop from the nearest town, but sometimes he got up earlier than usual in the morning and drove into the city to choose meat. It was cheaper there. Joe had a big refrigerator in his shop, but he tried not to buy too much meat at a time and to sell it before he bought more. One Thursday, a woman came into the shop at 5 minutes to 1. "I'm sorry I'm late," she said, "but some people have just telephoned to say that they are going to come to dinner tonight, and I need some more meat." Joe only had one piece of good meat in the shop. He had sold all the others earlier in the day. He took the piece out and said to the woman, "This is £6.50. "That piece is too small," the woman answered. "Haven't you got anything bigger?" Joe went into the room behind his shop, opened the refrigerator, put the piece of meat into it, took it out again, and shut the door of the refrigerator with a lot of noise. Then he brought the piece of meat back to the woman and said, "This piece is bigger and more expensive. It's £8.75. "Good," the woman answered with a smile. "Give me both of them, please."
Unit 9. Joan's mother loved her very much, so she was not happy when she married an army officer when she was 21 years old and went to live in another country with her husband. "When am I going to see Joan again?" she thought. "And how is she going to live abroad among strangers without her mother near her?" Joan wrote to her parents every Sunday, and then, a year later, she had a baby. It was a girl, and she and her husband gave it the name Kate, and thought that she was the cleverest and most beautiful child in the world. After that, Joan's parents received plenty of letters and postcards every week about Kate and all the wonderful things she had done. There were also lots of color photographs of the baby, but there was never any news about Joan herself. Joan's mother knew that parents always thought that their own children were special and better than any others, and she also knew that they photographed them all the time. So she did not find all this news about Kate and all the photographs of her very interesting. She wished that Joan's letters had more news about herself and what she was doing in them. When she replied to Joan's letters, she always asked about her. She wrote 2 or 3 times, "Are you tired after the baby? Are you resting enough? Is Fred," he was Joan's husband, "helping you? Does anyone come in to clean your house for you? When are you going to come home? Do you need anything? Does the baby keep you awake at night?" And other things like that. But Joan's replies were always about Kate, and there was never any news about herself. In the end, Joan's mother was rather angry, so she wrote to Joan that she was very glad that Joan had a very clever child, because she herself had never had one. Unit 10. Mr. Anderson lives in a big city in America, and last year he came to England to visit the small town which his father had come from. There was a big square garden in this town, and one day, while Mr. Anderson was walking past, he stopped outside it and looked in. There was beautiful grass in the middle of the garden. It was green and short and soft. A gardener was watering it, and Mr. Anderson said to him, "Good morning. Is this your garden?" "No," answered the gardener. "It isn't mine, but I work here." "How do people get such beautiful lawns?" Mr. Anderson asked. "Ours are never as good as this." The gardener stopped his work and looked at Mr. Anderson. Then he said, "You come from America, don't you?" Mr. Anderson answered, "Yes, but my father came from this town." "Well," the gardener said, "it's easy to grow lawns like this." He asked Mr. Anderson to come in and said, "Let me tell you about it." Mr. Anderson went into the garden. "My name's Anderson," he said to the gardener. "Joe Anderson." "What's yours?" "My name's Gray," the gardener answered. "Pete Gray. Now, about the lawns. First we sow our seeds. Then, when the grass appears, We pull all the weeds out. After that, we cut the grass every week. We water it every day when the weather is very dry during the summer season, and we sometimes roll it. Oh, Mr. Anderson answered. That's very interesting, Pete. And how long does it take before the lawn becomes like this? The gardener thought for a few moments and then answered, Oh, about 400 years.
Unit 11. Ted had not seen his old friend Sam since they were at school together. Then Ted saw Sam at a business meeting, which both men were at in a big hotel, and he went over and spoke to him. "Hi, Sam," Ted said happily. "How are you?" "I'm very well, thank you, Ted," Sam answered. "And how are you?" "Not too bad, thank you," Ted said. They sat down side by side and began to talk. "I've got a wife and 2 children now," Sam began. "Well," Ted answered, "I've got a wife and 3 children myself." After half an hour, Sam said, "I must go and buy myself a toothbrush now. I left mine at home. Let's have dinner together this evening, and then we can talk more." "All right," Ted answered. They met in the restaurant of the hotel, and they both began to talk about television. Ted said, "I think it's very bad for people. When I was a young man, we did things ourselves. We didn't just watch other people. In the evenings, we sang songs, or played music or cards with each other, or we read the newspaper, or found ourselves something useful to do." Sam nodded. "Yes," he said, "that's true. And perhaps once a week, or once a month, we went into the town specially to see a film in the cinema, and maybe to buy ourselves an ice cream. And now," Ted went on, "my children watch silly films on television almost every evening, and they don't do the work that their teachers give them. What will they do with themselves when they leave school?" "Yes, it's very bad, isn't it?" Sam said. "But what can we do about it?" "Well," Ted answered, "I've promised myself one thing. I'm going to sell our television set as soon as the football season finishes at the end of this month."
Unit 12. Bobby was 6 years old, and he went to school. There were 19 other little boys and girls who were in his class, and they were all friends, so they often went to parties together. When one of the children had a birthday, he or she invited all the other children to come to a party. And at Christmas, all the mothers gave parties for all the children. Bobby liked parties very much. He liked the games they played there, but he liked the nice food more. His favorites were cakes. Before a party, Bobby's mother always asked him not to eat too many cakes, and Bobby always answered, "Yes, Mummy." But he always ate all the cakes he was offered, and more if he could get them, and sometimes he was ill. Christmas came again, and again there were a lot of parties. Bobby went to all of them. The last one was on January 6th. It was 2 days before school began. One evening before this party, Bobby's mother met the lady who had invited him and his friends, and she said to her, "Bobby always eats too many cakes at parties." "Oh, that's all right," the lady answered. She told Bobby's mother not to be afraid, because at her parties a child could only have 3 cakes, and the cakes were small. "Oh, good," Bobby's mother answered happily. On January 6th, she took Bobby to the party and left him there. When the children began to eat, there were enough cakes for every child to have 3. But Bobby took 4 and began to eat them. "You can only have 3 cakes, Bobby," said the lady. She asked him to put the 4th one back on the plate. "I can't," answered Bobby. "I ate that one first."
Unit 13. Mr. Harris used to work in Dover, but then he changed his job, and he and his wife moved to another town. They did not have many friends there, but they soon met a lot of interesting people, and after a few weeks they often went to dinner or to parties at other people's houses. Then Mrs. Harris said to her husband, "We've been to a lot of other people's houses, and now we must invite them to our house, mustn't we?" "Yes, certainly," answered her husband. "A big party will be the easiest, won't it? Then we can start to invite people to dinner in small numbers next month." So Mrs. Harris said, "Yes, I'll invite all our friends here to a big party on the 5th of December. "How many will that be?" Mr. Harris asked. "Don't invite too many." Mrs. Harris was beginning to write the invitations when her husband saw that she was writing "Party 6:30 to 8:30 p.m. "That isn't very nice, is it?" he said. "You're telling our guests that they must go at 8:30. So Mrs. Harris just wrote "Party 6:30 p.m. A lot of guests came, and they all had a good time, so they did not go home at 8:30. In fact, they were still there at midnight, when the doorbell rang and a policeman arrived. He said, "You must stop making a noise, because someone has complained." Mr. Harris said he did not want to quarrel with the policeman, so everyone went home. They were sorry to have to go. When Mr. and Mrs. Harris were alone again, she said to him, "That was a surprise, wasn't it? Who complained about the noise?" "I did," Mr. Harris answered in a tired voice.
Unit 14. Peter was 10 years old, and he went to the city school. He was very good at football, so he was in his school team. He always played very well and bravely in practice games and in matches, and he scored plenty of goals. Peter's grandfather and grandmother usually came to see him when there was a match, and they were always happy when other people said, "Your grandson plays very well, doesn't he?" Then one day, Peter said to his grandmother, "We're practicing for our big match next Saturday. Our school's going to play against the garden school. They have the best team in our city, so perhaps they'll beat us. Can you come and see the match?" "Oh, yes," his grandmother answered. "Your grandfather and I will be there, and I'm certain that you'll beat the garden school." "Well, I hope we will," Peter answered. The match was in the park, and it began at 2:30 on Saturday. The garden school team wore orange shirts, light blue shorts and orange socks. and Peter's team wore dark blue and white shirts, white shorts, and dark blue socks. In the first 2 minutes of the match, the garden school boys came very close to the city school's goal. But then the goalkeeper kicked the ball to Peter in the middle of the field, and Peter ran with it and kicked it straight into the goal. All the city school boys, as well as their families, were very happy to see it. After he had scored once, Peter scored twice again, before half-time. Then, in the second half of the match, he nearly scored another goal, but he hardly touched the ball with his foot, and the goalkeeper caught it easily and threw it out again. After the match, Peter's grandfather said to him, "You missed a good chance to score a fourth goal then, Peter. If you'd kicked the ball hard, you'd have got a goal easily. Why did you kick it weakly?" "Because there were tears in the goal."